All right, this is a conversation with myself about the person versus the individual, and I suppose the meaning crisis and knowledge and all the kind of stuff that is often talked about in this little corner of the internet. It's been something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and it's connected with a lot of things that I talk about, which is primarily divided man. And I had never overlaid these on top of each other exactly. So by the divided man, I mean the man who is not integrated. The man, I don't even want to say actually like human being or so, because it's not a human being. Here's my basic frame, is that I think within the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of humanity, the individual and the person co-evolved coterminously at the same time. So like we were, I think this happened, probably around the time of Christ, and the seed, this has been happening since the beginning of time, I think. But I think it really happened at the time of Christ, because within a Christian frame, and to riff on John Bayer, that's when we had the first true human being, the end of the creation of man and what a man is really supposed to be, which is, to quote, I believe Irenaeus, right? God became man that man should become God. So that's the first true human being, and it is finished. Is the end of creation, it's the closing of the day of the creation of man, and closes that kind of back to the creation account of where it was good. At the end of the creation of man, that we don't have that same parallelism. It was good, and so that's the end of the creation of man. So we have this individual and this person evolving at the same time, branching out from the tree, and because before that, kind of in a Charles Taylor or a whatever way, we had the the porous selves. We didn't even really have a self. We just had kind of a homogeneous collective group. It's not even like groupthink really in an Orwellian sense. It was just like we were such a part of a bodied whole, within a family or a clan or a group, that like you couldn't even think of an individual. See, we didn't even have that. We didn't have an individual or a person. You didn't even think of yourself as apart from the group. You couldn't. But now we live in a place where you can. We have this kind of autonomous, isolated individualism, which I think is kind of the mode of anti-being, I would say, that's constantly a competition with a healthy human being or a person. And so the person, so that's like the divided man, the unintegrated self, or in a Petersonian way, it's the person who lies to themselves, the person who is divorced, where their psyche, their conscious mind is divorced from their body, and we live into these patterns of dishealth, and we are disconnected from our body, like a Wim Hof kind of a way. We are so... What happened in this evolution, the possibility of now the individual or the person, one of the benefits, and I think this was a necessary benefit, this is where it gets into like the necessity of, my friend Jess, would say the U-shaped journey or a fall or something, would be that part of the evolution of a human being is to, and this happens at every level, it's a symbolic reality, right? So it's happening cosmically to mankind, but it also happens to individual human beings. You're born as a baby, and you're one with your mother, and even biologically and physically, but also just existentially. There is no separation. I don't think a baby or a child, even, this is ancient stuff, getting into Oedipus and all that stuff. Peter Rollins will talk about that a lot. You're in the oceanic oneness with the mother. and I would say even with the world, like that works symbolically, the Mother Earth, and then at some point you realize the self. There's the evolution of the ego and the self, and you realize like, oh, I am not at one with the world, and I am an other. It's the otherness. That this is something, and I am something, and there's a divorce, there's a break there, which is different than I think pre-Christian kind of paganism, and kind of this is why all this enchanted world stuff, like PBK and Dreher and Kale Zelden had this big conversation about enchantment and Christianity and what's going on in the world and how do we re-enchant the world, and they talk about a lot of great things. McGilchrist, who I think is great on this, but I would be in line with Malcolm Guite to say, like, we don't need a re-enchantment. We just need a realization that the world already is and always has been enchanted, which is iconography. So we live in this place. I'm trying to piece all this together, but I have all these different mosaics. So follow me. I'm trying to lay out all the pieces to paint the larger vision. We live in this place that's disintegrated and divided against itself and divided against the world. And that is the divided man, which I would map one-to-one with the individual. The individual, and this is how we talk about things. This is one of the big Petersonian faults and insights, is he talks about the individual in a way that's very unhealthy, but he also talks about it in ways that are very healthy. Like when he says, tell the truth or at least don't lie, what that is primarily is in my framing, I would say that's dying to individualism and being awakened to yourself as a divine person. And a person is not an individual. It's not isolated. It's not disconnected from him or herself. We're not lying. That would be where your psyche and your body are at one, and that would be health. You're not doing things and living into patterns consciously with your volitional will and choice, because the entirety of a human being is like the soul, the nous, and which is comprised of spirit, mind, and body. So like when your mind and your body and your spirit are all at one, that is a true human being. That's a person. That's Christ by definition, almost, that is the divine person. But we live where those things are not at one. They are not synced up. They're not in harmony. And that's the individual. That's the divided man. And I think until we get that framing, I think most people have this default framing of the individual and the collective, which I would say is downstream of the Industrial Revolution, machine thinking, a mechanistic universe. I think it has a baked-in materialism and like a deistic component where God is fundamentally other and distant and separate and not in the world. That's part of iconicity and enchantment. And so I guess, I don't know, hopefully that makes sense. If people watch this, I would love points of clarity or questions if that doesn't make sense. Because I really think the distinction between the individual and the person is huge. It's just huge in this discussion. And that gets into my personalism and what I mean by personalism. And you're never going to understand personalism if you come at personalism with the frame of the individual and the collective. Because the individual and the collective is a machine. You're a cog in a wheel. An individual is a replicant. It's the Borg. An individual is not a unique human being. It is a isolated, dead object that is part of a large. It's in the world of systems and machine. Like think a lot of what Paul Kingsnorth talks about. And it's a means to an end. It's a tool of an ideology. It's a slave of a principality or an egregore. Whereas a person is a servant of God, a living sacrifice, a completely unique, free thing that is free in its slavery to Christ, because Christ is the only master that allows true freedom, and this is where the words are hard, because I wouldn't say individuality, but true personhood, true uniqueness. It allows a person to be not an identitarian that is just a slave to an ideology or a systematic way of being. And this is where I'm very anti-systems. Systems are for laws and replicants and ideologies. A system can never produce a person. Systems produce individuals, and individuals die because they are divided men. They're divorced from reality, and they lie to themselves and the world. So this gets at one of my other things that I want to talk about, because it gets into like what is and is not a Christian. And this came up in that conversation with PVK and Dreher. Because anytime people are talking about churches and who is not a Christian, every time, if you pay attention, every time it is about self-identity around ideas. So a Christian is one who self-identifies around these ideas, like I understand where some of this is rooted from. Like, if you confess Christ, like he who is, if you profess with your mouth, and believe in your heart, like that whole thing, or like, this is how you discern if one is from Christ, if he affirms that Jesus came in the flesh, from one of the epistles of John, I believe. So I understand all that, but we can't make the anachronism of applying a modern consciousness to, this is the myth of rationalism and the Enlightenment, to like these millennia old texts. What they meant, what they were talking about with that, and I think this evolution of the individual and the person, like that was in its infancy. And so like when they are talking about profession, it has I would argue that the kind of confessionalist, abstracted, divided man stuff that we have going on was just in its infancy then. And so to root who is a Christian and who is in the church by the around self-identity of one's ideas is lunacy. It's a bad idea. It's a really bad idea, and it's foolish because we don't know. And I think people would affirm this in a Sunday school answer. Like, if you say one who claims and professes to be a Christian and goes to church all the time, does that mean they're a Christian? Well, of course not. But why do we talk that way then? So then this gets at like a conversation that, we've been talking about this for years, but my buddy Jeff had a conversation with Paul where he asked, what is a Christian? Like, what is it? Is it one who does the rituals? Well, not necessarily. I don't know, how does PVK describe it? But again, PVK's description falls into divided man categories in a divided world, because PVK, I think, says a Christian is one who, it's something like, loves Jesus more than he loves himself, or obeys Jesus more than he obeys himself, or something. Because again, like, that's this divided world, divided man. It doesn't work. Because what does that mean? Like, who are you apart from in him we move and have our being? This is that whole, like, baked-in deism that I'm talking about. Like, this is why I talk about icons and panentheism so much, is because, like, those kinds of framings are just silly. Like, they're platitude level, and I think they've lost their utility. And truly all belief, like, this came up in a conversation, really. Paul was talking about this when he was talking about helicopters. And like, what is your knowledge of the helicopter in kind of that post-Vervaeke Esther Meek conversation? He's like, you don't know what a helicopter is. If you tried to draw it, it would be like a 5-year-old. You have no embodied experience with a helicopter because all of your kind of conceptual belief or ideas about helicopters are utilitarian. They're heuristics. And you don't need to understand helicopters that way. But if you were a helicopter pilot, you need to understand it better. That's how all of your ideas are. So then when you use that bit of reality of like your belief and your idea and your profession of helicopters, and you take that back to Christ and and your ideas and self-identity, you have to understand that that's all utilitarian and heuristic too. And so, do you believe in Christ? Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, what does that mean for you? Is that like a get out of jail free card, get out of hell free? Is that a get to heaven thing? Is that about social bonds and social cohesion and not having your community reject you and not dealing with pain now? Does that mean even unconsciously parroting certain words and phrases to avoid pain? Like, all of that stuff, and like, this gets into the fear of being bullshitted, and I'm not saying like, whatever, be scared of being bullshitted, but I'm just saying, like, if you are a man ununited, if you are divided to yourself, you can't possibly know all those things. And so to root who is and who is not a Christian in self-identity is nuts, because we're liars. And so I'm not saying like go down the infinite regress hole of like trying to root out self-deception, because that's not going to work either. So I think, I mean, there's practical implications for this. I would say tell the truth, or at least don't lie, especially to yourself. I would say practice traditionally proven and long-standing traditions of holiness in a tradition that you were raised. I mean, this is all stuff that people know. Like, people know how to be a good person. It's just, we know at the level that is, and we know what a good person is because you see it, you recognize it. We are participating in being, which is inherently good because being is rooted in God. And so there's part of us that's always calling out to that. We know what it is. I think a lot of what we need is to reintegrate ourselves, is to die to the... This is why the U-shaped journey is important, I think, because to overcome the divided man, I think we need to die. And that happens by God's grace naturally in our death, like that's just going to happen. But also it can happen every day by the grace of His Spirit, I think, in dying to ourselves by loving other people as, you know, the two commandments: love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Like with your family, when you're in conflict with your family, which I'm having some of that right now, what does it mean to love them as much as you love yourself? Well, it's to not get bitter. It's to be long-suffering. It's to live into the fruit of the Spirit. Like, just do that stuff. I don't know. So this is long. It's rambly. It's primarily supposed to be about the individual and the person, and not automatically talking about Christians as those who self-identify with certain ideas. I'm going to stop it there. Hopefully you got the forest and didn't miss it for the trees. All right. God bless.